Karin, thank you very much for giving up even more time. And I know that you've already agreed that you're going to do a few sessions, but I feel it is a must on my part to thank you anyway for each occasion that you come.
It's my pleasure.
It's so brilliant that you actually you like it as much as I do, which is quite a lot.
I was slightly apprehensive in the beginning to talk about myself, but you made it very easy, as I said before, and I so far enjoyed it, and I'll see what happens.
Good. It's for you. It's in some ways, I guess, it's a trip down memory lane, and for me, it really is an adventure, and that's how I will consider it and live it as you tell the story. So. I don't think my words of introduction can do it justice. So please, just jump in and tell us the next installment, please.
As an aside, before I do that, I've been dreaming about all these years, and I all of a sudden talked about it more than any time before to people who called me. So I didn't remember what we talked about last time, which means I'm really into the whole experience, and it's in one way fascinating, and in another way, I'm simply very grateful that I did have the experiences that I had, in spite of the fact that some of them were very sad. Those I will talk about briefly during this session. But we're still in Texas after my year at Rice University. And before I left Texas for a short vacation with some friends, I was bridesmaid in rural Texas to a college friend of mine, which was quite an experience because I had only seen America from college angle. So all of a sudden I saw family life, and that was very exciting. And shortly after that, I spent a few weeks in Colorado with a friend and his family who came from Texas, and they had been at the wedding. So that was another rural experience in America, and it was very, very pleasant. I saw a lot, which was kind of a stepping stone to my return trip, which started in New York. I stayed with Jewish friends of my parents, and we had a very emotional time, because that was the time, 1961, of the Eichmann trial on television. And of course, my friends who had lost their parents at Auschwitz and a brother who had been shot were very, very much involved, and I was trembling along. That was a very, very deep experience that really shook me, but much more than what happened later when I was on the boat. We were going, the Fulbright students were sent by boat by the Berlin, which was a 10-day trip from New York to Bremerhaven. And before I'd left Colorado, my friend had told me one of his contacts from years back had told him that the American Air Force was flying with live nuclear ammunition over Europe. At that time, we didn't know why, but it was kind of scary. So on the boat, we had fun. We reminisced among the students of what had happened in the year before. And then when I arrived at Bremerhaven, which was on the 14th of August of 1961, I realized what had happened, why there had been live ammunition on American planes. The wall had gone up on the 13th of August. So I happened to return back into that period of time, which in a way touched me because of having known something frightening before and something happened politically. But afterwards, I kind of pushed it all away because it was readjusting to Germany, readjusting to family life, and readjusting to studying at the University of Heidelberg. It took about 2 more years before I got my diploma in translation from the Dolmetscher Institute, the Translators Institute of the University of Heidelberg, with a diploma in English as a major and Spanish as a minor and law as a hard subject, as I would say. Excuse me. So after those years, I kind of recapitulated what had happened during the years before. So it was a time of thinking. It was not a time of doing. I took on a job as a translator for a credit information bureau, Kreditreform. I was in the international office of it in Neuss. And to be honest, it was relatively boring because it was always, day by day, it was the same thing. You had to report on what other people told you about the financial aspects of companies or individuals, and you had to rewrite it in a different language. And I had to rewrite it in German, but the information came in English and Spanish. And when our French translator wasn't there, I had to do that too because I'd had French in school. And since it was always the same thing, it was relatively easy. I could even do it, part of it in Portuguese and Italian.
Okay.
So it was that kept it alive, but the work itself was very, very boring. So after about 2 years, I said, could I do it from home? So it was home office even then. They let me do it from home. I went to Neuss once a week and picked up the things I had to translate and brought them back the next week. And in between, I'd met somebody I later married and therefore had more time for him, for myself, and for my family, because working at home, if you do it in a concentrated way, is easier than working in a large office. As I said, those years were not important because of my work. It was important because of my personal life. And Ken and I got married in 1966 in December and left for the States in end of 1966, arriving on January the 1st or 2nd, I don't quite remember. And we settled in Cincinnati. It was like homecoming. All of a sudden, I had an American name. I had at that point no problem with the language. I had an American accent. I'm some sort of chameleon because I respond to whoever I talk to. And by now, my language, my English, is a mixture of American English, international English, and English. I did not ever go back to the British English, the la-di-da English that I was taught in the beginning.
La-di-da. Okay.
That's what it was called.
Okay.
We had English students at Heidelberg University, and when they heard me talk English, they said la-di-da. So to me, that is la-di-da.
Okay. I think I should rename my website, but thank you. Yes.
Now, so those were interesting years. They were emotionally very, very lovely with Ken. So early in 67, I arrived in Cincinnati, where we settled. And Ken was a representative of an aluminum company and was traveling a lot. So I decided I'm not just a housewife. I want to do something. So I went to the German department of the University of Cincinnati and asked the chair, Guy Stern, whether he had a job for me. And I thought of maybe something at the library or whatever. When he heard that I'd already had a diploma from the University of Heidelberg and what I'd done before, where I'd studied, he said, okay, now you're a student of German literature and language. Within 15 minutes, I was signed up at the University of Cincinnati with the help of a German student who guided me through the process. And not only did I have a job as a student, I also had a part-time job as a teaching assistant. And as far as teaching was concerned, I was supposed to teach scientific German, which was right up my alley because I had loved science and my father was an engineer, so I knew that part of the German language very well. And so I said yes and started teaching and studying and living in America as an American, basically, because something told me that there was no accent when I was talking American at the time. A friend of mine who born and raised in Delaware came and heard me teach that summer. And since summers were so hot in Cincinnati, we had to start at 7:30 because there was no air conditioning. And so all the doors were open and I was teaching halfway in German, halfway in English. And he must have stopped by there because half an hour later he said, Karin, you have to tell me, where did you learn your German? And I started laughing. I said, what do you mean? Yeah, your German is perfect. And I said, well, then my English is perfect as well. No, as I said, I'm a chameleon and it changes in terms of diction. But no, that was kind of a stroke on the shoulder. That was a compliment, and I took it as a compliment, and I liked it too. The German department was a very busy department. I got thrown into all kinds of aspects of teaching, research, radio, editing, co-editing, what have you. But that was basically not what I wanted to talk about now. I wanted to go into some very sad period in my life because 2 years after we'd been married, Ken died of a heart attack. I made a decision right away, within seconds. I'm going to stay in the States. I'm not going to go back because I knew my father would cover me with love and protection and so on. And my mother, of course, she was very, very, she loved Ken as much as my father did. And she was in shock and in pain. So I said, I'm not going to go back to Germany to stay. I left the States with Ken's ashes because he wanted to be buried in Germany, where he knew my family and he loved them. So I arrived in Germany with the ashes and stayed there for another 2 months.
Can I ask, was Ken American or was he German?
He was American. He was American of English, Irish descent. He came from Kentucky. But he was not. He was not the typical Kentuckian. His
Okay.
favorite saying was the question, do you know what the best thing that ever came out of Kentucky? And he said, an empty bus. That was his Kentucky joke as a Kentuckian. You may want to cut this out, I think.
No, we'll keep it in. These nice little personal bits are, yeah, I think that's what partially gives it an additional element and a dynamism to it. So,
okay,
yeah.
You do what you want. But so I came back to the States after the burial with my mother, who stayed with me for another month or two to make it easier for me to readjust. And in the end, she would have loved to stay. I took her to New York because she had bursitis, couldn't carry any luggage. And when she left through that hole at the airport, the gangway, she said, don't let them buy you back. She knew why I was in the States, and these words have given me the backup and the strength to do whatever I thought was right and stay in the States alone without a direct family. I did. 2 years later, I had news from Germany that something was wrong with my mother. We didn't know what. And I was lucky, as so many times, through contacts from the German department to Washington and to a program that looked for American teachers of English for North Rhine-Westphalia. I got into a program that brought me into North Rhine-Westphalia as an American English teacher for a North Rhine-Westphalian school, and which was ironical in a way. And I was lucky I could choose the school. I heard all the options, and I chose the school that my brother had graduated from, which was 3 kilometers away from my home, my parents' home, so that I could stay home, take care of my mother, and teach. The teaching was fun. I loved the students. The teachers were a mixture of good and bad and indifferent. There were some who were between 40 and 45 who had received their schooling and their university degree during the Nazi period of time, and somehow it reflected in their attitude. I didn't have any, or tried not to have too much contact with them. On the other hand, there were some of the age of my father who had been at that school too, old school friends of my father's, and they were lovely. They were shortly before retirement, and this way I had a system of protection within the school. But once the school was out, that school year was over, I fled. I escaped back to America. My mother had died in between, and nothing could keep me in Germany at that time. I was devastated. I needed to get back to America, where I knew I had friends. I knew I had the support at the university, where I had a job and where I had my life without any impediments from childhood psychosis or whatever you want to call it. This not being able to trust after the Second World War kind of had followed me not into America. There I was absolutely free of fears or restrictions, whatever. But whenever I came back to Germany, I felt, do I belong here? Don't I belong here? I don't think I do. So I was very, very happy to get back to the States. And
Can I just ask about the yes, because the social makeup element is fascinating, and I think of I think it's in geology when you want to study history, you look at the layers, and sometimes you have a layer of ash where there was perhaps a fire, and then earth has grown above it, and so on. And when I look through sort of generations of people, in some ways you can also trace back these kinds of sociological elements through the characteristics and the methodologies of people. And it's fascinating that you take a similar approach in your appraisal of the people before the war who had studied and learned and begun their roles as teachers and so on, and those who had learned during the war, and obviously those thereafter. And for you, those who had studied under the Nazis were forever tainted. Is that possible to use that word, tainted?
They were tainted if they behaved that way. I didn't prejudge them. I didn't prejudge that generation of teachers or people at all. But when I felt that they were either not truthful or they had the Nazi attitude of we are better than the others. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
It's okay. So you was basically saying that you didn't prejudge the people who.
No, but right. I didn't prejudge them. I watched them very carefully. But when I saw these teachers, or some of them, or quite a number of them, without respect for the students, without understanding or wanting to understand the students, and simply stood there with their fist, and at one point said, we are not allowed to beat them anymore, but I would love to beat this little boy, 12 years old, to the pulp. That kind of reaction always threw me back.
Understandably, yeah. And, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I take a similar approach to people that I work with, but also when I was a scout leader in London, I took a similar approach to the kids who were 12 or 11 or 15. For me, I had to show these people respect to get their respect back. It didn't matter to me that they were so young. They still had opinions and thoughts and feelings, and they still needed to be respected.
Yes. I had two classes, Quarta, which is 7th grade.
Okay.
I think so. And I had two classes, I think 9th grade. And these were kind of in between fish and flesh, as we say. Okay. They were heavily under attacked by their hormones, so they were very difficult to handle, and I didn't want to handle them. They were used to the fact that their teachers stood there as like policemen, saying, you have to do this, you have to do that, and the other. And I went in there and I said, I'm not your policeman. I come from a different way of teaching. I've taught adults, and let's try and see what we can get to together. Some other teachers who also taught that class later asked me, how do you get along? And I said, well, they're unruly and so on. I'm trying. And he then went to the director and said, this class is unruly. Even Mrs. Clark cannot take care of them. At which point I didn't respond. I didn't go say anything. He got the class. He got a different class. I kept the class. And within weeks, I had their trust. and they had mine. And I did it spontaneously, not having really thought it through, but we were supposed to have a Lektüre, meaning outside reading, which they had to read at home and we'd discuss at school. And I said, okay, we can do Goethe, we can do whatever you want. We can also do Ian Fleming, To Russia with Love. They didn't know what to say, and then all of a sudden everybody said, yes, we'll do that. And I got some of the people who had never read an English book, that they read throughout the night to read this book. And that broke the ice, absolutely. And then they got very disappointed when I started analyzing that book, saying, here the tension, the sexual tension is built up to a point, but it is never released. Here the violent setup is brought up to a climax which never comes. So they were all of a sudden not just reading English, they were also discussing English literature in terms of analysis. For 15, 16-year-olds, that was fantastic.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, when you show people that you are willing to listen, that you are willing to, and hear their thoughts, and give them the responsibility to think for themselves, and where that thought can actually lead to some kind of action. They engage so much more than simply being told, you do this or you do that.
It's absolutely. I had contact to some of them years later, and it was amazing that those who had started at a very, very low grade had, even after I'd left, had worked themselves up to the highest grades. So, it was like an initiation into learning and initiation into English, which was wonderful.
Fantastic.
But as I said, the situation at the school to me was very uncomfortable because of this mixture of signals. And then there was strange responses when they heard that I was writing a dissertation. One teacher, the English head teacher, he had never contacted me, although I was teaching English. He had left the message when I came in that I wasn't supposed to teach them American English. They were absolutely held to talk British English. You should have heard his accent. I said, okay, I can do either. And I did both in parts. When I saw that it would help, I did the American lingo, the real jargon, which they, of course, knew better than the English. But then I gave them fodder with British English. I had a wonderful time with these kids, but the whole situation was kind of strange because this one teacher who had shown no interest in me other than telling me that I shouldn't teach American English, when he heard that I was writing a dissertation, he came to me and he said, I'm collecting first versions of dissertations. Would you please send me yours when you're in the States? It floored me. I would never have thought that anybody would lay themselves so open to criticism. He was in charge of my teaching, basically. He had never contacted me. Only when he heard that I was writing a dissertation. Did he want to have a copy of it? No other interest, what have you. Well, so it was a mixed bag. I had lovely times with my father's friends, but as I said, I was very happy when school was out, and the next day I was on a plane to America.
Well, I mean, you sort of return to Cincinnati, and because this was a different return, wasn't it? So the first time you went there, you were with Ken, and the second
return,
time,
yes,
and
the first time was alone to Texas. Then the second time was with Ken.
Yeah.
The third time was with my mother, as I said, who understood why I stayed there. And to this day, it was, like a big support system that I could really rely on my own reactions to my life, that I was free to do, even though I knew how difficult it was for her, after having lost Ken in a way too, to lose me as well, basically to America.
Yeah. So on this latest return, then again you were returning alone.
I was returning alone after my mother had died and after school was out.
Yeah. And then you stayed in Cincinnati until 1977. So this was quite a long period.
Long period of time. I got back, and first they helped me by giving me two assistantships, one teaching and one research assistantship, so I could survive.
And what year was this? Was this 1970?
This was after I came back, 73.
73, okay.
With the promise that as soon as one was open, I would get an instructorship. An instructorship paid more, was more independent. I was a yearly job, and it was the lowest end of the faculty, but it was very much alive because the students related to us instructors more than they did to the professors. We were basically the caretakers of the students.
And what was it like with women instructors or lecturers? Were there many of them? Because the way that you tell the story, it seems as though they were very encouraging, of you, pushing you forward, putting you into positions because they could see your ability and your potential. Was that sort of ubiquitous with regards to other women, or was that simply an isolated case?
No, it was not isolated, but there weren't that many women. There was, on the faculty were two women. One later became my doctor mother. The other one had psychological problems, and everybody else had to teach her courses. All the others were men, and some of the men were chauvinists, and some were very supportive. So I couldn't complain. I was thrown into, I thought, the best positions, more even than the other instructors. I got chances to do things that I otherwise would not have had a chance of trying out.
I've temporarily lost you, Karin. I can't hear you.
Okay.
Oh, now you're back. Okay, sorry.
Okay. No, I was not treated. I was not treated better because I was a woman. I was treated better because I had the degree in Germany.
Okay.
They knew, or they thought they knew what I could do. They threw me into all kinds of things I had never taught at the university. When they told me, you teach scientific German, I went in there and I did it. And apparently I did it well, because 2 years later, they gave me the chance to supervise the 3 sections that there were. In terms of teaching assistant, or the assistants in teaching and assistants in research, I was linked to the chair of the department. None of the others were. There were 4 instructors. I was the only woman. Then we had a guest professor from Germany and his wife. And his wife was supposed to teach a seminar. And apparently she had never taught before, and she was hopeless because she didn't know, and nobody told her what to do. So I was thrown in there co-teaching. And within 2 weeks, I was teaching alone, a seminar I hadn't focused on. Then came an international edition of Lessing yearbook, studies of Lessing and his time in English and German. We had an editor, we had a co-editor, and I was the co-edit. I was the second co-editor, and I had to do the final editing of the whole book in English and German, and with comma and full stop, period. Mm-hmm. That stayed with me. I can still do it, and I'm still doing it for everybody else, editing and telling them, where the comma and where the full stop should be, with the proviso, I cannot do this in English. I can only do it in American English, as far as interpunktion, punctuation is concerned.
Is it the Harvard system or some such? Yeah.
Now, a sideline, when I wrote a book on in England for an English publisher, and I had written it in American. It was a book on Berlin, which we had, my ex-husband and myself, we had written in German and English. I'd given the German to him because every time he had touched it, I had to research it. So he was responsible for the German. I was responsible for the English. He never read the page of it in English. I wrote this, of course, because it was a book on Berlin. I justified it to myself that I wrote it in American English because it was big city, and big city has a nonchalance in terms of language, in terms of attitudes. It was closer to New York than it would be to London. In England, when you want to call somebody a bloody liar, you say, oh, you're very economical with the truth. Mm-hmm. In New York, you say, you're a damn liar. So these things I was trying to avoid by doing it in American English. It got into the hand of a British London editor for the company, for the publishing company, and he changed something like 2,000 commas and full stops and what have you, and quotation marks. And when I saw that and said, no, it's not impossible, it's impossible, he had to redo it. I mean, he had to take them back because he had not realized that it was a different system. And in that sense, it was in the editing, or the co-editor of the International Lessing Yearbook was really, really giving me a background which has helped me all my life. Another aspect of these years was I was responsible for departmental things. I was responsible for the younger students, particularly the young women students. Of course, they called me day and night, and the others did too. We were the service element of the department for students. And so many of my students became very close friends. And I was only 3 years older than they were, or 4 years. That was something I was taught, how to deal with people without dealing with them, but listening to them and giving advice without telling them what to do, which is the hardest thing. Otherwise, advice is, you do this. No, you can't. You can't talk to students like this. Whether they're 18 years or whether they're 24 years. And I later had students who were in their 60s. We had a retired monk who came into German classes, and he stayed in my class when he was in his 70s. So, we had to deal with all kinds of questions and problems and mentalities, and it was good education. What else? Then friends had told me that they were starting a radio frequency, a non-commercial one, and I think in all of America there were only 10 or 20 that were not commercial or associated with organizations. And they came to me and they said, would you do a program on Germany or in German even? We are here in Cincinnati, which is a German town. We want the German element of the public as well. There were 50,000 German-speaking people still living in Cincinnati, of 500,000.
Oh, it's quite a bit, 10%.
That's quite a bit, yes. Cincinnati was a German town. The beer industry was Wiedemann and Hudepohl, and not far away were vineyards along the Ohio that looked like the Neckar or the Rhine, and one part of Cincinnati was called Over the Rhine.
Uh-huh.
So there was a good reason for the radio people to. They were young people. They were trying out what they could do, and they did a good job with that radio station, WAIF. Wave.
And were the Germans there before the war, or did they move, or did they immigrate after the war?
They were there from 1845.
Okay. So
1848. The first big rush toward the States when democracy was being pressured in Germany.
Okay, yeah. I mean, the 19th century in itself is an extremely fascinating subject, and if you want to go into that at some point, then I think we could do that too, because it is interesting, the development of national identities and political and social movements too. But for the purpose of this Cincinnati thing, it's interesting. But still, I mean, 10%. That's a very high percentage for a non-German city.
This is why the university was a city university, and the German department, in terms of the language departments, was the biggest one, of course. Although during the Second World War and during the First World War, they had taken German out of schools and out of the universities because of the wars.
As a safety precaution for their own personnel, I guess. Okay.
Yeah. Well, not safety, but also repression.
Okay. Yeah.
Because the Nazi elements in America are still there.
Yeah, well, I mean, in many cases, the Nazi element in America was there before it was in Germany, but that's a different conversation entirely as well. So,
Okay,
okay.
the Huey Longs and so on and so forth. Yes, it was, you had that in England as well. You had
Mm,
brown skirts,
yeah,
brown shirts.
yeah, yeah. But
Black,
yes,
or, no, they were black shirts, right?
I
The Mosley people.
mostly, I'm not sure about that, what they were called, but I'm familiar that the movements, the groups were there, and not all of them were sort of low level. So a lot of them in these countries were rather high level.
Yes,
And this is perhaps one of the elements which people tend to forget, because it's not just the gangs that carried out the thuggery, but it was the people that funded them at the top, which is the main
absolutely,
problem.
absolutely, absolutely. No, I mean, Nazism was perfected in Germany. I don't want to take anything away from the guilt of the German Nazis, because the American and the British Nazis did not have the power. They didn't have the backup of the society, not the backup of the industry as it was in Germany. So I can't really compare them in terms of viciousness.
Mm.
They're by now they're just as dangerous in all those parts of the world. And there it's and they have an international network, of which I will to which I will come back later when I talk about the last years in Cincinnati, when I was building up a small Goethe Institute at the university, and I had contact with all the German associations, and I was responsible to have the contact with them. But that's a different story. It ties back into what we are talking about right now.
Sure. Okay. Can I also ask these years? So in some cases you were absent from Cincinnati, you'd returned to Germany, but in other cases, so from 1960 until 1973, you'd been in and out of the USA, and obviously your main sort of reflections here have been academic within the educational institution, even though
from 66 through 72, I was in Cincinnati.
Okay.
So that's a span of 5 or 6 years. And then I was in Germany for a year, teaching and taking care of my mother, and then came back in 73, and finished my PhD in 75.
And in that time, you can only consider the social situation in the USA as tumultuous, I think. In Cincinnati as well,
Yes.
in 67 and 68, you had the Avondale riots. There was a lot going on. I know we probably don't want to reflect on that now, but maybe a bit later. But generally speaking, how much of this were you A, aware of, and B, affected by what was happening outside of academia at the time?
Academia was a kind of protected area, of course, but we had black friends who were right in the middle of it, and their friends were killed, and we were never without close contact with what was happening outside.
Were there committee meetings that you took part in? Were there occasions where you, not quite an underground, but I mean, if you were involved with these people, I can only imagine that you came together to understand, to nurse, to assist in some way.
We were friends, and we didn't have any formal contacts of any kind, but we talked all the time. It was we were loose groups. I was not an activist in that sense. First of all, as a native German, they could have always thrown me out if I was doing something that they didn't like. I couldn't become an American citizen after my husband died. No, differently. When I came into the States, it would have taken me 5 years to become an American citizen. Ken died 2 years after we arrived, so I was reassessed and had to wait another 5 years. In those years, I was out of the States for 1 year when I was teaching and my mother was ill. So I came back and would still have to wait 5 years for an American passport. And then I said, not with me. I'll keep my German passport, which put me in a position that there were things I couldn't do. And so I was always in the background, pushing as much as I could. As I had done in Texas during the sit-ins, I was during the riots, we couldn't do anything anyway. Not the students weren't that involved. It was the black students were involved. The white students kept away from it, I must say. And there's one instance, though, I told you that I really didn't scare very easily. I knew Cincinnati by heart in terms of going by car, and my shopping center was something like 8 miles out of the city. And one time there were so many diversions that I ended up somewhere I didn't know where I was. And this was during the riots. And I thought, I couldn't find it on the map where I was. You didn't have a Navi then. So there was a gasoline station, and I wanted to go there. And then I saw there was a bulk of young blacks in their late teens, early 20s. And I thought, if I turn around now, they're going to be after me if they see that I'm a white woman. The only thing I can do is go straight at them, walk out of the car, go to them and talk to them. And as a foreigner, you always have the possibility of letting know that you're not an American. And I started to stutter and say, I don't know where I am. Can you help me? And, they were starting to get aggressive. And I said, I couldn't find it on, what do you call this, card? Oh, no, map is what it's called. And one of the guys said, what do you mean? You're not American? I said, no. Yeah, but you speak American. I said, I've been here for 5 years. Where you come from? Germany. Oh, my brother was in Germany, and he had a girlfriend in Germany, and he liked it so much. What can we do for you, love? So they got in the car. They escorted me back and front until I knew where I was. I was safe.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So if you're nice to people, they're nice to you most of the times. There are instances where I wouldn't test it, but I was lucky. So yes, it involved everybody who traveled or who went from one part of the city to the other. And of course, we were in Clifton where the university was, and there were some riots there. But the apartment house where I lived in had very early on opened up to black students, and particularly black baseball players. So we were very safe with black baseball players in and around the Forum, which was the name of the apartment buildings. And I have to retract as far as not being scared and not having any barrier. My parents, when I came to visit them from America, I came and brought black friends with me. And they stayed with us, and they conversed with my parents, and they came back while I was still in the States. They came back to visit them. I could always bring in whoever I wanted to. My parents never turned anybody away. And my two brothers had some friends, yes, but I was the people catcher. I don't know how many times, even during the time I was still living in Germany, I would come and with 5 or 6 friends at night, and the first thing my mother would say, "Have you eaten?" And she would cook up something, Bratkartoffel or whatever was there. And there was always some wine in the cellar, in the basement. So,
were your parents anomalies in this sense?
Yes, I should think so. Maybe 10%. 10%. Okay. And since I took them for what they would do in terms of liberal things, my father alone would not have been that liberal, but together with my mother, and my mother was fantastic. Basically, and this is what I've never said to my family, basically I lived the life she should have lived. My father was the guy who studied. My mother had to leave school when she was 16. She was a housewife most of her life, and she should have studied and done all the things and seen all the things that I've seen. So she was always beside me, no matter where I was.
And hence those
gave me
words.
A lot of strength.
Hence those words when she left from New York to make sure that you did what you could.
Yes. No, I can only say, and I said that to my niece some time ago. I said, when I'm no longer here, don't anybody cry. I had a good life with all the bitter and the sweet and the interesting and the pain. It was a good life. I had a full life. I had, I think, a much fuller life than they had. And I would have wished for my mother to have had a fuller life.
Well, I hope your fuller life continues for many, 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 many years ahead. So, diving back into the Cincinnati then. So at this point in your, so you, after you returned, it took you 2 years to get your PhD. Is that correct?
No, first I came back when I came back from my mother's funeral, it took me 2 years, yes. Okay. I got my degree in 75.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how was it then thereafter, getting your degree? Was it then your status was suddenly then elevated to a higher position within the university? Could you then move forward in academia? How was it?
No, that was the big problem. My doctor mother, she wanted me there. She wanted me in the department, and she even put her job on the line. She told me, but they wouldn't allow the exception because they had a university-wide rule. Anybody who got a degree, a major degree from the University of Cincinnati, had to leave the university for 5 years because they said, we don't want incest of ideas. Uh-huh. Again, I was lucky because my doctor mother had contact to the people of the Goethe Institute in New York and in Germany. And they wanted to set up a position at a university where the university would provide the room and some small funds. And I was salaried by the Goethe Institute.
Okay.
And was at the university, had a room there, had some funds there. And my job was to service anything that had to do with German outside of the university, or in terms of contact with other universities, like programs that cut across from one university to the other, meaning when a speaker came from Germany and was guided through the Goethe Institute network to give speeches or performances wherever. We were the contact people, and we also gave the contacts to our neighboring colleges or universities. So I did a lot of things with the University of Indiana, which was 150 kilometers away, but I also had to travel to certain schools where they had the courses that Goethe Institute offers. We didn't a one-person affair like Cincinnati couldn't give courses according to the Goethe Institute method. But I was in charge of going to the colleges that could and attend their examinations and okay their examinations. Plus, I had, of course, there were quite a number of visitors from Germany coming through Cincinnati now. And then I was in charge of dealing with questions as far as German schools and German associations in and around the area. The tri-state area was the Cincinnati area, which bordered on Kentucky and Indiana. And so I had direct contact with all the German associations in Cincinnati, and there were 16. Because it was a German town, and it had influences from 1848 till now, basically. The associations were there from the 18th century onward. Their names were something like Bavarian Support Association or Club, Palatinate Support Association or Club, and so on and so forth. 16 of them. One of the largest one was the Germania, but there was an umbrella organization which was led by Herr von Ristenberg. Herr von Ristenberg was approached me saying, I'm third generation American, but at heart I'm German and I still believe in Wotan. And I kind of swallowed. And later I heard that he was having everybody under his thumb by showing them his gun collection and by walking around only with his Doberman dogs. Mm-hmm. So he was feared. And later I discovered that he had connections to all throughout America and all the German Nazi groups. And it was an international association network where he was also involved. He was the one who had told me that I couldn't have the two films on Nazi documentaries shown in Cincinnati at the university. That was Mr. von Ristenberg.
So, I mean, this international Nazi organization, I mean, did they approach you often, or was it just through this figurehead?
They didn't dare. They didn't dare. They knew after 2 attempts, they knew they couldn't work with me. And they left me in peace. And And there was that one organization called Germania, which was more of a cultural umbrella. And the one who was the chief or the boss there, he had been, and I had lots of conversations with him. He told me he had been an SS person from Croatia. There were quite a number of Nazis of German descent in Croatia. And he said I was not in the armed part of the SS. And from what we had to do during the time when Hitler used us was we were always sent to the front, and most of my friends have died. He apparently came into the States in 1947, and it's amazing how many Nazis were allowed into the United States, not just the scientists. And he had really become not a liberal, but he had understood what had been going on in his country with his background, and he was trying to lead a normal life. He wanted to be a German American, which meant halfway liberal. And he protected me. We had lots of conversations, and he knew where I stood, and I knew where he stood, and what his background had been, and where he had come from. So I was very grateful to him, which kept me out of trouble.
It's amazing, really, because I mean, you're talking about essentially your academic career. You're talking about some of your personal relationships, and yet around you is an explosion of politics, of human rights, civil rights, fundamental questions of liberty, democracy. These things. It's like Cincinnati comes across as this melting pot potentially for all of these different elements within it. And yet there you are, sort of, growing up, la-di-da, to use one of your words, developing into the person that you later become. I mean, obviously you've drawn on the strength that your mother gave you, but in your later career, did you also sort of look back at what you had to live through in Cincinnati and use that as a form of strong foundation for
the foundation
the career that you had?
of Cincinnati were my friends. I had friends who were in the Now, Freedom Now, Women's Rights Now movement. I had black and white friends in the civil rights movement, close friends. So whatever I could, from my position, do for them, with them, I did. I was not the activist who went on demonstrations, because the first demonstration, if they picked me up, I would have been thrown out of the country. So because they knew me and they knew how I thought and what I thought, they came to me with questions. What do we do here? How can we get in touch with that person? What shall we do? Trying to get support from the press in Germany, whatever. So I could pull all my experiences together and pass them on. And this has been my life. Many people have kept all the information they got from the outside for themselves because they wanted power. I gave them all back. I spread them all. I still do this today. When friends call me and say, what shall we do? How can we do? A colleague just called me yesterday and said, I don't know how we can help one of our people at the Heinrich Böll house, a Yemenite, who is ill, and she's ill, and she's being sent from doctor to doctor. And I said, why don't you go to that and that and that doctor? Because I had contact in Cincinnati with his sister. His sister was one who translated for me at one point, and she became a Bürgermeister, a mayor of part of the town, of one part of the town. And she introduced me to her brother, who is a doctor in Düren, where the Böllhaus is. So I'm continuously spreading information, and I still do that with pleasure. And I did it at the time. I tried to help where I can. Yes.
It's fascinating because, I mean, some of the experiences that you talk of also, I've seen in a much smaller context within the Armenian community in London, where, there were people who were involved with politicians. But if anybody else wanted to talk with these politicians about, Armenian question, international law, they had to go through these people. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, they would never pass on the contact information.
Absolutely wrong.
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely. Because once these people were no longer involved, those contacts were gone. Mm-hmm. And it was such a short-minded, short-sighted way of doing things. But you're so right, as in this concept of power that people have is infuriating, because you ask yourself, what's important? The position or the chair upon which you sit, or the success of the mission you claim to represent? Which is more important?
I was always doing it für die Sache, for the thing we were fighting for, also with pen and writers in prison. Other people were doing it to advance their standing someplace. I don't know where. The thing is that once I had pulled together a huge network of people who worked together, they liked each other, they trusted each other. Once I stepped out, when I stopped in that position, it fell apart. So I'm still in touch with these other contacts, and whenever needed, I refer to them, and I refer them to others, because it's useless to have a position and not use it, or have knowledge and not use it.
Mm. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Karin, this is going to be a slightly longer one, so I think we should probably pause there, and then we can look at the next time after this, we'll have a little chat and plan our next session. But then we can look into the latter years, as it were, of Cincinnati, go into the nitty gritty that you suggest is hiding there in your notes, which I'd love to draw out into audio form.
We'll see.
Yeah, indeed.
If I remember, yes.
But thank you very much again. As you intimated earlier as well, so this was a slightly more painful, or at least a trip through some painful years for you. So thank you for doing that, even though I'm sure it wasn't always easy to talk about some of those items.
Well, it's I made it easy for myself. I skipped over them, basically, just mentioned them. I didn't let myself be drawn into the emotion that was yesterday. Thinking about what we were going to talk about today, then you go through the emotions. No, it's all of this is fine. If you tell me where I can find the broadcast.
Yes, indeed. So let's close this off. So all the best. And
Thank you. I'm looking forward to next time.